Hi everyone, this video recording will kick off our weekly lecture videos. Now what I realized is that perhaps it is easier if I record the lectures, which I will make available on Padlet. Instead of long recordings, I will make shorter ones, release them over the course of the week. What you're expected to be doing is to engage with the ideas that are proposed through these videos. Think about them and engage with them by creating your own responses. The responses can be made in the comment box. You can also create a new post on Padlet in the form of a video, a drawing, a link, a photo, or an attachment of a website, or any other creative ways that you can think of. After all, you are visual arts students, so please be creative in the way we converse with one another. On Padlet itself, feel free to move around the boxes and have fun with the image board. So when we think about the museum, we often think of it as an institution that holds many different things inside it. It has very old objects that are of historical value. The things that the museum contains is often called a collection. Part of the aim of a museum is to collect things that the institution thinks is of cultural or historical value. So let's start with the very basic question. Why do we collect? How do we collect? What purpose does a collection serve? Let's begin with this photograph that you can see on your screen here. It is taken in the 19th century and shows a royal household belonging to the Sultan of Kutai. Kutai is located in eastern Kalimantan on the island of Borneo. By the 18th and 19th century, the Malay political system have spread across island Southeast Asia, and many kingdoms, especially those that are connected to the business of trade and are located at strategic river or coastal areas, have adopted this political structure. One of the interesting features about this political structure is that it has a theatrical dimension to it, meaning that its ways of doing politics is framed through ceremonies. The anthropologists like Clifford Geertz would often call this Nagara, or the state, a theater state. He calls it a theater state. The Nagara is a kind of theater state. Often objects play a role in these ceremonies, and they are meant to express certain concepts of power. This is to say, they are meant to also to be seen. In this photograph, we see the Sultan and his entourage. One of the interesting points to note is that his palace attendants were made up mostly entirely of women in the court. We not only see them posing for the camera in neatly arranged rows, but that some of them are also carrying in their hands certain objects. Now we can immediately see, flanking the Sultan, who is the central figure, two ladies, each carrying a rather large kris sword, that the attendants are required to rest the sheath blade on their shoulders. Next to one of them is a male attendant carrying a closed umbrella. The rest of the figures are seated on the floor, and immediately behind those standing figures, I think you can faintly make out that they all have some kind of bowl or something in their resting in their arms, seated in a cross-legged position. This photograph suggests that the power and prestige of the Sultan, in fact, the very office of the Sultan, comes from a certain kind of social hierarchy that is visualized with the Sultan at the center, and that this office of a Sultan derives its power from certain objects that are on display here, that the objects themselves form a kind of collection that then defines the Sultan and his power is the central feature of many monarchical traditions, not only the Malay ones, right? But what is perhaps unique about the Malay political system, as opposed to, say, maybe the Chinese one, is not so much that these objects are seen as magical. In fact, all monarchies tend to share this belief that in trying to define its sort of like concept of power for the king. But what is unique in this instance is perhaps that these objects are often displayed and shown to the public, meaning that they're meant to be seen. Now, in the next photograph, I'm showing you how in another sultanate in Indonesia, the objects were placed and displayed on a flatbed. And these were sort of shown during a public celebration for visitors to view. It's a very different format of displaying things than the ones that we're used to, whether we see a painting that's being hung on the wall today or a sculpture being put on what is called a pedestal. A local exhibition tradition here suggests that the horizontal bed or cushion was created as a kind of platform to showcase objects. Now, what I've done is taken the liberty to imagine what kinds of objects that one might find being displayed on such occasion. Typically, they could consist of a chogan. In this case, the image comes from the chogan of Johor Riau Sultanate, which you see here, which is this fan-shaped object over here with scripts sort of like written across it. Um, or you might also, in this case, find a sword. This is a sword. The image comes from the famous sword claimed to be of Indian origin called Churasi Manjakini from Perak. And then there's the trumpet called the Nafiri of Johor Riau. And then there's the Ponto Bernaga or the armlet from Perak here. Or the Mestika Embun, also from Perak, which is this crystal ball that you can see here, which also, Mestika also means a sacred stone, or the Kucing Emas from Brunei, or the golden cat, as you call it, or the Payong of Brunei, which is the Payong is the umbrella that you can see here, or the Hardawlika, or the Naga from Jakarta that you can see here. That's also a kind of like vessel, right? Or the Puan Nagataru, which you can see here, which is a kind of like vessel, which you can see here, which is a kind of like a vessel, in order for you to put the betel leaf, which is a very important component of the ceremony, which is to offer betel leaves to your guests so that you conduct your businesses while you're chewing betel leaf. Now, please bear in mind that what I've shown up here on the screen is a composite, meaning that it's assembly. It's my personal assembly of different objects taken from different sultanates. They do not belong to a single collection. What I want to highlight is that there are a range of objects that are normally associated with the office of the Sultan and helps to give legitimacy to the Sultanate as an office, meaning to say that without these objects, the person cannot become a Sultan because he is cut off from his source of power. In this way, we can think of the collection as playing an important role in constituting what power is. What is interesting to also note in this instance is that while objects are considered to be old, perhaps of historical value, there is often no way of proving that. In this sense, the object can be thought of as both old and new. There's a paradox here that perhaps is difficult for us to understand today based on our contemporary understanding of time. Now, the art historian of Renaissance art, Alexander Nagel and Christopher Wood, suggests that when it comes to such objects with perhaps a religious dimension to it, meaning to say that it is an object or work of art that is imbued with some form of spiritual power, often the object contains what Nagel and Wood calls double historicity, meaning to say that an object can both similarly be new and recently created, but also old in terms of how the viewer perceives the object. Which is to say that, like the office of the Sultan, which a person can aspire towards, the physical object can also aspire towards an ideal form and fulfills the ideal form as a physical manifestation of that ideal, so that the physical umbrella we might see in front of us serves as a physical representation of something bigger. And this is the royal power of the protective function of the Sultan. While the royal power is always there and is connected to the office of the Sultan, the physical object could be something that is hypothetically made yesterday, But the whole idea of double historicity is also about not making things very clear, uh, so that it seems like it's also something that could be old, could be of historical value. So, for example, the Chura Si Manjakini sword that you see here on the screen is always said to be something that came from very far away, from India, uh, and its source of authenticity and power lies from the fact that this is something that traveled very far across huge distance and is treasured because it comes from very far away. The power here in this sense is not always indigenous or always coming from the land or being pre-Bhumi. Power is connected to this concept of one's ability to mediate what is foreign and local, what is upriver versus what is downriver, what is us with what is the outsider or what is them. And that is what the Sultan, and that is why the Sultanate is often situated at river mouths or seen running coastal port cities, because he too is an entrepreneur mediator that mediates resources that comes from the inland of the jungle and trades it with goods that passes through his port. In this way, the assembly of objects in his collection that represents his office actually helps to tell a story about his office and his role as this mediator figure, right? In a similar but different mercantile context, we see a different type of merchant figure who will also have developed an interesting collecting culture. Now, this can be seen in a complaining poem written by a Korean, Yi Cho-won, from 1758 to 1832. He is a member of what is called the Yangban class, who sought to uphold the prevailing Confucian order against a successful Chungin businessman, Kim Han-tae. Now, Chungin are a professional class of translators. They're also great travelers because they translate between Korean and Chinese languages, and as the role requires them to sort of like travel a lot. As a result of that, they manage to um, uh, uh, they managed to become increasingly sort of like wealthy and started to show off by collecting objects that they've acquired through their travel and putting them on display on their shelves. A genre of painting called Chakari actually developed out of this collecting culture, which you can sort of see up here on your screen. This genre of painting is interesting because it really shows the kinds of like things or objects of curiosity that many of these Chungin class translators or interpreters were beginning to sort of collect around the 18th century onwards. But this poem is not happy about this group of people. The poem itself, I think, really in some ways exemplifies the social and psychological tensions between the Yangban and the Chungin class in the late Joseon society. It also highlights the very features that make late Joseon such a dynamic and interesting sort of like period. On the one hand, you have the Chungin class making a sort of like assault on the authority of the traditional Confucian values represented by the Yangban class, right? Who favors sort of like austerity and lacking in ostentation, whereas now you see here a class who's trying to show off the wealth and the things that they have sort of like acquired. It also speaks about the remolding of an economic power and class structure, a rising materialism, which includes the astonishing imports of new objects and unprecedented conspicuous consumption. Now, conspicuous consumption means that you're sort of like showing off what you're consuming rather than hiding behind the scene and secretly sort of like, consuming all these sort of like objects of luxury. You're actually sort of like, showing off and letting people know that you have made it. Kind of like, how you would use Instagram today and start sort of like, throwing out money or posing beside a car or advertising that you're going on a staycation and stuff like that. But what this is a symptom of is a symptom of, you know, a dynamic change within the society that perhaps even suggests a sort of like flourishing of commercial activities and opportunities for artists and craftsmen at this point in time. So you see more goods are being on display also means that there are more things being sort of like sold and there are more things being sort of like made. Therefore, the study of a collection in many ways tells us something about a particular culture, its aspirations, its goals, and perhaps even its anxieties. But it only tells us about these anxieties only if we cast our net wide enough to look at things around the collection, such as this sort of like complaint poem written by this very anxious Confucian scholar who is probably very, very jealous of all the cool little things that this Chongqing class person, translator, has managed to sort of like collect from themselves and was probably showing off all these things to all the nerdy scholars out there who thinks they know the world or knows everything about Chinese culture because they have read all the Confucian classics, right? But I think, you know, the Chongqing and the Sultanate examples, both examples do point to one thing, that when we think of collection, we can no longer think in terms of neat national boundaries, identities, and ownership. So, for example, typically we associate Chinese porcelain with Chinese cultural production. How great Chinese culture is, blah blah blah. Everything is centered on, you know, the fact that this was sort of like produced in Chinese land, and it represents sort of like, you know, a symbol of sort of like, you know, great sort of like craftsmanship, all that kind of like stuff. That's one way of thinking about it, but I don't think it's the only way, and it's also not always the most interesting way to think about it, especially when we view it through the lens of collecting culture. What if we were to shift the perspective a little and think of the reception of Chinese porcelain as it enters another person's collection? What we see instead is a whole different way in which value is accorded to these objects. So, for example, when we look at some of the images I have on the screen here, on the left is a photograph of an elaborate plaster work and a repeating banks of miniature niches in the interior of a Swahili mansion that dates back to the 18th century. That is now the Swahili House Museum in Lamu, right, in Kenya. While the two images on the right, up and down here, shows elaborate sort of like decoration, interior decoration, featuring also a patrician sitting in a richly decorated sort of like reception room in a house in the Lamu town from the 19th century. The photographs immediately force us to confront a different reality. The manner and care in which the porcelains are arranged in these two different households, and perhaps they're also prompting us to question, what do these objects symbolize and mean in the context of an East African merchant household? What value does it bring for them when they were displayed, and what kind of like value might they sought to sort of communicate to the visitor? More importantly, in what ways? Uh, uh, More importantly, in what way? In the ways that the porcelains are sort of like displayed, the photographs also show how playful and creative these objects are treated as they sort of enter a different cultural universe and find new value as status objects that are not meant to dignify through, they're meant to sort of dignify through projecting a cosmopolitan world that the merchants hope to persuade his visitors about. After all, as a trader, you want to convince and persuade your customer that you have access to the best goods from all over the world, right? So think of it like a 19th century sort of like version of live streaming your service for your customer. Viewing it through this lens, then maybe it makes our topic of sort of like collecting culture relevant to our contemporary times through a different way. not in a way that says, oh, because it is a Chinese porcelain and that's why it's significant, because it's part of our Asian culture and that's why we need to sort of study it. But I think it's significant because these objects were part of a larger history of intercultural exchange, of in which people exchange things and in which things moved around and acquire a life of its own and enter into a different cultural world and is given new meaning in that cultural world. I hope this story of wealthy Korean translators, mediators, sultans, and 19th century live streaming businessmen give you a sense of what we can think about when we think about collecting cultures. And the readings of week 1 will further suggest more examples for you to think about. So I highly encourage you to sort of do this week's reading before you proceed to the second week's reading, right? Now, all of us collect things, and they might be for different reasons. Some for the purpose of pursuing a hobby. Others have a specific emotional connection to the things that they decide to keep close to them. I have different things in my collection, and it comes principally from my travels around the world. For example, this is an armlet that I've bought from a tribal market in Congo, in Kinshasa. So it's a tiny little thing I managed to sort of buy because things were so expensive there. You cannot believe how expensive Congolese sort of goods are. I think something like this costs about 20 USD. But it's a memento, it's a keepsake of my first and only time traveling to sort of Africa, you know. And then I have a lot of like, you know, little amulets that I've collected, you know, from a church outside of Quiapo in Manila, Philippines. It's a reminder of a fascinating marketplace of all the different kinds of magical objects that you can find there. And then there's, for example, the Islamic prayer beads that was given to me by a friendly stranger in Iran, simply because I look exotic enough, and he wanted me to remember our friendship, you know. And it still does. It has that magical ability to remind me of that friendly encounter that I have in Iran, and the warm hospitality they've extended to people that they don't even know, just because that we were there at their homes, right? There's also, for example, this cute little doll from Indonesia by the artist Eko Nugroho. There's a constant reminder of my connection to Yogyakarta's art community, and because I used to go there a lot for work. And finally, there's William, which is this soft toy I got from New York. It's the mascot for the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It's an Egyptian sort of hippopotamus painted in sort of like fions. And so it's all, I mean, I've always found this a cute enough mascot for me to adopt as something that reminds me of my interests and my passion for the arts. But in the 21st century, I think my most prized collection really are my hard drives, you know, filled with archives and images that help me to put together lectures, tell stories to students, and draw interesting connections between artistic cultures and phenomena from all over the world. So what do you collect? Can you share your collection with us? Please respond. And I'd like to sort of hear about what are the important things that you hold dear to your life that you can tell to your collection. Thank you.